Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna Wittenberg and K.S. Barton each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 38, in which Johanna and I are answering questions given to us by my book club. I'm K.S. Barton, author of the Norse Family Trilogy, in which a young Viking woman and a Viking warrior are caught in a deadly blood feud between two brothers. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hi, how are you doing, Kim?
I am great. How about you?
Pretty good, pretty good. So I'm Johanna Wittenberg, author of the Norse Woman series, and my latest book came out in April, which is The Irish Queen, set in Ireland, book 8 in the series. And I also recently had a short story published by Flame Tree Press in an anthology called The Valkyries.
That ought to be exciting.
Mm-hmm. And that has an introduction by Nancy Marie Brown, who was a former guest of ours, and also Johanna Friedrichsdottir. She is the one who wrote the book about Valkyries.
Yes, yeah.
All right.
Cool. Okay. So for this episode, I asked members of the book club that I facilitate at the library where I work, and I asked them for questions. And so I want to give a little shout out at the beginning to these women of my book club. It was nice of them to take some time to give us these questions. And here's what I asked them. If you could ask a question to an indie author, what would it be? And so now Johanna and I have some answers.
And these questions look like a lot of fun.
Yeah. So the first one. All right. Harry Stack Sullivan of the Interpersonal Theory of Psychiatry once remarked that people are more universally alike than different. Having said that, what methods, procedures do you take as a writer to avoid ascribing current, taken for granted ideas and norms to another population? I think that's a great question.
It is.
Yeah. So you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, the only answer really to that is research. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you just have to really research the heck out of it, read as much as you can about that time period, and especially archaeological discoveries. If there's not a lot of historical books available, which the time period you and I write in, there's not a lot of historical books. We have the sagas, but they were written 200-300 years later.
Or we have the books written by the monks who had an axe to grind.
Yeah, exactly. So you always have to take that with a grain of salt. But there are some known facts, like, for example, slavery, which will come up later too. But, slavery was a way of life. It was like having appliances. We have appliances, they had slaves. We have washing machines, they had slaves. Otherwise, you had to do it yourself. And I think those people in that time period could no more imagine living without slaves than we can without our appliances. That said, I'm not really sure you truly can do that. I mean, I don't know that you can really look at things from the point of view of somebody who lived centuries ago. I don't know that you can.
Right, I agree. Mm-hmm.
You can just try.
Right, yeah. Well, yeah, it's the research and learning. I know you have too, like reading history about the people around them and stuff. But like we could never put our minds in somebody who owned slaves and probably didn't even pay attention to them. But I actually thought about slavery as well because of that, because it was such a part of the Viking Age ecosystem, right? It was just a part of their world. But I didn't want I needed my characters to have them because in my Norse family series, my female main character's father was a jarl, right? So they would have had slaves working in their house, with their livestock on their farm, doing all kinds of things for them. So they would have been a part of the fabric of her life. So mainly what I did is like what you were talking about, like maybe she just didn't even think about it, right? Like
I
they
don't
were
think they
just there.
did.
They were just part of her life.
Hmm.
And her mother was a healer, and so they didn't, they weren't as abusive as maybe some people might have been. But then when my main character was 7 years old, I think it was seven. It's been a while since I've written that book. She was abducted by some outlaws when they were traveling, and they were telling her, "Oh, you know, you're a pretty little girl. We're going to get a lot of money for you. We're going to sell you." And so
Hmm.
as she grew up, that defining moment of her life made her like kind of empathetic, like to at least the slave girls. Like that could have been me. That easily could have been me. So I'm not going to, you know, mistreat you. I don't want to have slaves of my own. So I had to give her like a reason why she
Hmm.
didn't like that. Otherwise, I don't think it would have been believable that she would have just been like, whatever, this is what we do, because it was
It would
what
be hard
everybody
for
did.
a modern person to relate, and that's the
Right,
thing. You've got to make your characters relatable somehow, or you're going to lose your readers.
right.
Um, and in my first book, I had Olaf, who was a king's son, abducted, and he became a slave. And I
Mm,
showed his metamorphosis, his struggle to get out of slavery. And that's the other thing about slavery is that anybody could become a slave and
right.
anybody could become free. Any slave could become free. There are
Hmm.
ways of doing that. And so I showed that in my book. And even though it's still really hard to understand, it might make slavery a little more palatable so that you understand that you know, it's not always a permanent
Mm,
condition. There's
hmm.
anybody could become a slave. They can people used to sell themselves into
Mm,
indenturehood to get out of debt, for example.
mm.
So, there's only so much you can do to make it believable, but having one of your main characters go through that is one way that I think really makes a difference for the reader.
Yeah. Well, my Helgi character, he and his mother had been
Hmm.
taken as slaves when he was young, and they were separated. And then so as he grew up, he was able to escape. And then as he grew up, he suffered tons of PTSD, but he also, yeah, he refused to own slaves because like he knew what it was like. And I'm sure there were plenty of people who maybe went through that experience and still
Yeah.
did it because they needed slaves to work their land or whatever. But I just wanted him to make that stand, to be like, I'm not going to put anybody through that. Plus
Yeah,
I
and that's
also
very
let him.
valid because that's
Yeah.
what our whole society went through that when we evolved away from slavery. We all made that decision or were
Yeah.
forced to make that decision in some
Yes.
cases.
Yeah. True. Yeah, it's a sad part of Viking life, but you know, Vikings weren't the only ones who did this. You know,
Yeah,
slavery was a part of
universal.
war. Yeah, yeah, true.
Another thing that I see as a big difference was their sacrifice of animals. That's another
Mm,
thing that it was definitely a part of their life, but it's something that your modern American has a hard time with because we love our pets. We can't
hmm.
imagine sacrificing, killing an animal, even for food, really. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
even
Right.
that's hard. Um,
Yeah, I include that in my books.
mhm,
The one thing I
you
did
have to.
not include that was horse fighting,
Oh, no.
because yeah, I was just like, I just can't go there. I'm sorry.
Mm-mm. I couldn't, there's no way I could describe something like that. But
Yeah.
it was common. And here's
Hmm.
another thing. My mother and father both grew up on farms, and their families, if they had too many kittens, they drowned them.
Hmm.
They just put them in a bag and drowned them. They didn't.
Ugh.
And my
Yeah.
grandfather, my mom's father, he was the sweetest, softest hearted man, but he did those things because that was, if your cats got too overpopulated, then you'd have a huge problem. And
Hmm.
it was just, or putting down an animal that was
Hmm.
old or sick or injured. Those are things we don't have to cope with. Our parents were such, like my parents raised me so that I could have pets and we didn't have to,
Hmm.
you know, didn't have to hurt animals. But, I was the first generation in my family
Hmm.
that had that. And
Interesting. Yeah.
it's a luxury really that people who live in a more subsistence way of life, they don't have that luxury.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Slaughter month. I described
Yeah.
slaughter month, I mean, that was the way it was. You killed animals, you culled them and only kept the ones that you were pretty sure would survive the winter. You just kept breeding stock because
Hmm.
otherwise those animals would suffer even worse of starvation.
Right.
But they didn't do it because it was kind. They did it because it was animal husbandry.
Right. Exactly. Well, in a
Um,
way, it was kind. I mean, might as
it
well.
was, but that wasn't their reason for doing it.
Right. No, no. But they did have pets, though. They did
They
have some
did.
pets. Like they had
Hmm.
dogs and they had some cats, probably mostly to keep the rodents and things
Well,
out
no,
of
there,
their
remember
food
there's
and
that whole thing about a new bride
the
gets a
kitten.
kitten,
Yeah.
and that I'm sure that cat was more than just a
Oh, yeah.
mouser,
Yeah. But, that was also, there probably also were mousers,
Well, everybody worked.
which made
Every,
them useful.
even the
Yeah.
kings and queens worked.
Yeah.
Nobody was exempt. And that was another difference, how hardy and tough those people were. I
Hmm.
mean, we can't even imagine. We wouldn't last 5 minutes in their world.
No.
And I think that people talk about women were too weak to fight and they couldn't fight. Well, I have a feeling that those women were a whole lot stronger
Yeah,
than
oh, yeah.
most men in our
Yeah, yeah,
society.
yeah, you're right. Well, and that's another thing I kind of had to change. Like if I wanted to show my characters doing anything, especially like my female characters, like I needed to get them away from like spinning and
Hmm.
weaving. And my character, she did a lot of like sewing and embroidery and stuff, like fixing clothes. But I couldn't have her doing that 20, 14 hours a day or something. I had to get her out of the house so she could like do things that would make an interesting story because like
Well, and I expect that weaving and embroidery was a rest break for them. It was kind of like TV for us. They were probably it was a big relief to get away from the
yeah,
farm chores. But they had to have. I mean, I show even my queens working in the fields because they did
yeah, yeah,
alongside their people. Everybody had to during harvest time. Everybody had to go out and do it.
yeah, that's true, that's true. Well, there is another thing that I wouldn't touch, and that's no, I did, but it was the bad guy who did it, is exposing their children.
Oh,
That was a thing too, like you were talking about it when you're living on subsistence living, then if you have a child who isn't going to survive without a lot of care, and what can you do? And so that was a thing that they did. It was
and every culture did do that,
right,
not just, I mean,
right,
in Ireland they did, Scandinavia, but I don't think it was necessarily as common as, I like to believe that it wasn't that common. We have no way of knowing how common
right,
it
right.
was,
But it did
but
happen.
it did happen, absolutely. And there are stories about it. I've read, a few stories where people happened upon a child who was being exposed and they took him in. There's a couple of sagas that have scenes like that,
Hmm.
and I can't remember which ones they were now.
Well, and they talked about that. They did that in the Vikings TV show.
Hmm.
Which was
One of the
uh
early ones.
Ivar the Boneless, right? They
Yes.
really Ragnar was thinking of exposing him because there was
Hmm.
something wrong with his legs, I believe. So
Yes.
yeah, and the mother was like, no, she didn't. I think they did expose. We're going to expose him, and then she went and took the baby back.
He went and took him back, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's stories about the baby being discovered by like
Hmm.
a wise woman or something like that. But I don't think they did it lightly. I think it was,
Sure. Yeah.
like you said, necessity. That's what I hope. But parenthood was a different thing. I read a book called Down the Commons, which is all about medieval life, a little bit later than what we're writing about, but it was in England. And they talked about it was the main characters was this peasant couple, and they talked about how many children of theirs died
Mm-hmm.
and how they didn't get attached to the children. And then there was one that they did get attached to, but he died. And how,
Mm-hmm.
even years later they were grieving him, but then they had a daughter who died and they didn't grieve her. So, I mean, we don't know for sure that this is true, but it really showed very graphically how they had to get used to infants dying because they died all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, the infant mortality rate was very high, and so was the death in childbirth, very
Oh
high for
yeah,
women.
yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, it's such a different world than we're so protected from all those things,
Mm-hmm. I
which
mean,
is
there's
good. I
still
mean,
plenty of people in the world who aren't, that are still
right.
living like that, but our readers probably don't have to even think about stuff like that.
I hope not.
Oh yeah, I know,
I hope
right?
nobody
Yeah.
does. I hope nobody, I mean, I hope we get to the point where no one has to, but
Make that decision.
yeah,
Yeah. I guess we make the decision now by deciding whether to have children or not for whatever reason. Like some
yeah.
people might be like, I can't, children are expensive, and they might decide, I can't afford to have a child. So at least here in this country, at least for right now,
There is that
there
choice.
is that choice. But for that time period, unless the
But
husband and
not
wife
having a,
stayed away
not
from
having,
each other,
yeah. Well, they did have birth control, but it wasn't that
sure.
effective.
Yeah,
I mean,
not
it
like what we
wasn't
have now.
right. But, deciding not to have a child is a lot different than
Right. Well, yeah, yeah.
killing a child, a baby that you gave birth to and that you're holding in your arms.
Oh
I
my
mean,
God. Yeah, I
what a
couldn't even
difference
imagine.
that would be. It's so, how can we even
Yeah,
go there?
I know. I know.
We can only go so far. We can't go all the way across that bridge.
No. And it would be nice if we at least, like if we were writing about the Tudors or something, when there's lots of letters that people wrote to each other and
Yeah.
things like then people were writing things. It doesn't always get like deep inside their minds, but at least it would give us some clues as to how
A lot.
people were thinking. And but we have nothing like that at all. So
In
we
some
have to
ways, it's
make them
very
as
freeing, but in some ways, it's not.
yeah. But I think if we were going to put ourselves like right in, like you said, we couldn't, and I don't think it would be palatable at all for a modern audience.
Yeah, yeah. It wouldn't be palatable for me, and
Me
I
either.
I
Yeah.
wouldn't want to write about it. So, yeah. So we go a little ways into that world, but we can't completely, it's impossible to completely immerse ourselves.
Mhm.
Yeah, especially when it comes to slavery and infanticide and even killing animals. It's
Yeah.
pretty tough. Even though even recently that's still part of a farmer's life.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, even I lost my train of thought. It's been happening to me a lot lately. I got a lot in my head that is swimming
I know
around in
what you
there.
mean.
I was talking to somebody about that, about like decision fatigue and all these things. And I was telling her, and I was like, one of the hard things about being a writer is that I have to keep my outside life with as few decisions as possible because I have to make every single decision for every single character, everything about this world. We have to decide every word we
Hmm.
put on the page. We have to decide everything about their lives and their inner lives. And so when I come out of that, sometimes I'm like, and if I maybe have to go to work or something, I'm like, I don't even want to think about what I have to wear today. I'm wearing a pair of jeans and a black shirt. That's it. Like, so I get, I get that kind of decision fatigue, but I also have all this stuff just constantly churning in my head. I'm sure you do too, when it comes to like other things that I have to do, things get kind of messy. So I think we've kind of even bled into the next question a little bit. Like, here's the question. What are some of the commonalities between how we see the world now and how Scandinavian cultures historically saw the world? What are some of the differences? Well, we've gotten into some of it.
Absolutely.
We were talking about like children and love, like, being attached. But there are stories. I remember you talking about a saga, and I can't remember which one or which king, that he loved his wife so much that when she died, he basically kind of kept her body almost like Snow White for like,
It was Harold Finehair.
oh,
And
okay.
that wife's name was Snowfrith, which
All
was,
right.
piece of the snow. And she was a Sami woman.
Mm,
And she was the daughter of the Sami king, and she had married him, but and he had, many, many wives and many, many children and many concubines. But he married her, and she supposedly cast a spell over him and held him in thrall. And so even when she died, she still held him in thrall. And her body remained uncorrupted,
mm,
even after death. And so it is like very likely the forerunner of Snow White. And he worshipped her, and couldn't be torn away from her. And I think he was an older man by that point, kind of entering his dotage. But finally, his advisor said, "Why don't we change her clothes? She shouldn't be laying in these same clothes." And so this is like after 3 years.
yeah.
So they finally changed her clothes, and all of a sudden her body just disintegrated the minute
Uh,
they moved her, the minute they, yeah. So that's definitely a folk tale, but definitely showing devotion,
yeah.
spousal devotion.
Yeah. And then I was struck by the saga of Eagle Skallagrimsson when he just like took to his bed after one of his second son, I think, died. Like he'd lost his
Hmm.
brother and two of his sons, and he was getting old, and he finally just like had had enough of this life. He was so despondent about the death of this son that he took to his bed for like 3 days before his daughter talked him out of it, and he wrote that lovely poem about his son, which so I remember feeling like, wow, here's this like one of the most brutal Viking heroes ever written down in a saga, and yet he had this soft spot for his children, so or sons at least. So,
Yeah, very much so. So, another thing I was thinking about is the slavery thing, and this kind of goes back to our first question. But if you remember, Heather Pringle's book, The North Women,
hmm.
she talks about slavery, right?
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
how
And she was on. See, I wrote it down. That was episode 25 when we talked to
yes,
her, and she talked with us about slavery.
and how there are modern day women who,
Mm.
had gone through that, not because they'd been captured and enslaved.
Those were captured by ISIS. Is that right?
Yes,
Hmm.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
And she interviewed them, and so that was kind of a big thing. It's one of the few ways that we can really reach back in time
Mm.
and find out how those people might have felt.
Hmm. Oh, it was so harrowing.
It was. But then the other thing is the attitude towards slavery was that, you could fall into slavery, but you could get out of it. And so I don't know how much of it was that they expected to lead a life free of that. Just like infant mortality and death in childbed and all those things, they were just accepted. Death from disease, those things were just taken in stride. They were part of life.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I was thinking about. Like, what's different? Like, at least with the modern U.S., is that they would have been much more accustomed to death than
Way
we
more.
are. Yeah.
Yeah, we just keep ourselves as far from it as possible,
Yeah.
until it actually happens, and then we're
Yeah.
not
Like
prepared.
children died young. I mean, I think it's been a long time since I've read about it, but I think I remember reading that the average lifespan of a woman was 40.
If that, yeah.
If that, yeah, yeah. So, or maybe that was the high end. Maybe that wasn't the average. But yeah, I mean, that's not very long.
The average age of any person, the average age in the Viking Age was 25 years old. I know that. That was the average age. So, but that took into account how many died in childhood.
Yeah.
So it was, yeah, there were people in their 40s and there were people even that were,
Oh, got
one of the
old. Yeah.
Osberg women was in her 70s or 80s.
I think Eagle
And
was pretty old too when he
yep,
died.
Harold
Hmm.
Finehair was supposedly in his 70s when he passed away. So they were, but they were just rare. And there were so
Hmm.
many that died young. So another thing, though, was democracy,
Oh,
or
yeah.
not democracy necessarily as we know it, but equality. We talked about that with Juliet some and with many of our other people that we've interviewed, but female equality, but also that it wasn't like a top-down society.
Hmm.
If you were tough enough to fight for yourself, you could you could prevail. And
Hmm.
and there
Hmm.
were rights that you had that were protected by law, no matter who you were, if you were a free person.
Right.
And that's something that kind of disappeared with the Norman conquest and with all with the pervasive Roman Catholicism that took over and made more of a feudal society. That's not how it was in the Viking Age.
Yeah, that's
It's not to
true.
say it was more civilized, but just that it was if you could fight for yourself, you could survive and you could have your rights.
That's true. Yeah.
And property rights. Remember this last time
Hmm.
with Juliet, we talked about women having, property rights that were protected by law.
Yeah, true. And I remembered what I was thinking about earlier, and this could be in either question, like how we relate to people or like the differences, is that the way they viewed murder and killing someone, like, okay, as long as you we talked about this with Juliet
Hmm.
too, about like as long as you if you killed somebody, as long as you like told like somebody about it or you did it like in front of people, it
You
wasn't
had to
really you had
you had
to
to stop at the first
yeah.
three farmsteads that you came to and
Yeah.
declare it. Oh,
So
by the way, I killed so and so.
yeah, exactly. So then it wasn't considered murder, right? They could
It was
still
manslaughter. It
yeah,
was
they could
manslaughter.
still they could want to get a weregild for that person, or you'd have
Hmm.
to stand before like the law speaker or the Gothi or whoever, something.
It was a civil matter
Right,
rather
right,
than a criminal. You weren't a
right,
criminal
right.
until you were outlawed.
Yeah. Or if you did it in secret. If you killed someone in secret, then it
That's
was
murder.
murder, and then that's not okay. So that's really different, this whole idea of
It's
like,
totally different.
as long
Yeah.
as you publicly kill somebody.
Yeah.
And
There's
then you
no law
mentioned
for that.
concubines. I hadn't thought of concubine, that was the thing. Lots of those kings and
Well, and there's
men had
a
multiple
lot
wives.
to make us think that, those concubines were not slaves, they weren't hookers, they were wives. They
Right,
were just wives of lesser status.
right,
And that was the same in many European
right. Oh,
societies.
yeah.
And even in, for example, Ireland, they it was common to have multiple wives of
Hmm.
different statuses, and they were covered in the legal code
Hmm.
about what they were entitled to, what those women's rights were. And that country had been Christian since, the fifth
Hmm.
century.
Interesting.
But it wasn't until much later that the church law superseded the common law, the Breon law.
Mm.
So yeah, they there was the first wife, the primary wife. There was the wife who it also depended on how much money
Hmm.
the two
Her
people brought.
status. Yeah, her
So
status.
the wife could actually have a higher status than her husband if she brought more cows,
Hmm.
because cows were money. They didn't
Yeah.
care so much about gold. They cared a lot about cows. That was
And
important.
sheep.
And sheep. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and also they recognized that there wasn't anything about like these bastard children. They were just their
Right.
sons and daughters. It
Yes.
wasn't a big deal. They were just part of the family.
Yep.
So whether the wives liked each other and cared for each other's children, that depended on the wives and the husband and stuff.
Hmm.
But even like I think I keep thinking of Tudors because I just read a book recently that took place in Tudor England. How many mistresses did Henry VIII have,
Yeah,
right? I mean,
exactly.
he always had a little harem going. So,
Yeah.
and a lot of those English kings, they all had Mr. Maybe I shouldn't say all, but most of them
It
had
was common.
mistresses.
It was common.
It was a well-known secret that it was an open secret that these men would have mistresses. And maybe the wives, especially if they were wives of, like some kind of an alliance, the wives might have been like, good, go see
Yeah.
your mistress. I don't,
Well, there are legends about jealous wives, and
sure.
one of them was the wooing of Etain, which is a very common, a very well-known Irish myth, where the first wife is jealous of Etain and she turns her into a butterfly and she flies around for like 900 years. These are the Tuatha and they're
Oh,
immortal.
yeah, yeah.
So,
Uh-huh.
yeah. So she flies
Interesting.
around for 900 years and finally she lands at another Irish god's home, and he recognizes her and brings her back into human form eventually.
Hmm.
And then there's the Children of Lear, where a jealous stepmother turned these children into swans,
Oh,
and they flew around until St. Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland, and
yeah.
then they came back to human form. But of course, they immediately disintegrated because they were hundreds of years old.
Hmm. Interesting. And that made me think of the I think it's in the Lex. Is it in the Lex Dela saga with Melkorka, the Irish
Hmm.
princess who's
Yes.
abducted and kidnapped and taken as a slave? And then I forget his name. He buys her as a slave and takes her home. And his wife is like, Shh, I want nothing to do with this other woman. So he built her her own little place to stay. And she had a
Hmm.
son by this man. And that's Olaf
And
the
that son became a king because he
Yeah,
was of royal
that's right.
Irish blood.
Yeah.
And she taught him Irish and sent him home to Ireland, where he was recognized, even though his mother was a slave and, he was out of wedlock, but they
Hmm.
didn't recognize, like you
They didn't
said, they
care about
didn't,
that then.
that wasn't a thing then.
He has
Yeah.
one of my favorite nicknames, Olaf the Peacock.
Yes.
I
Yes.
love that
I
because it
do.
tells you everything you need to know about him.
It does. It's really true.
Yeah, I love that story because remember she wouldn't talk.
Right.
She wouldn't talk, and then they caught her talking when she
To
was
her
thought,
son.
yeah, to her son when she thought they were alone. And I was like, that was a little bit of rebellion and resistance. Like, I have
Hmm.
control over my voice. And if I don't
Yes.
want to speak, I'm not going to speak. And I really admired her for that, like holding on to that little bit of herself and refusing to give that up to anybody.
And that was an attribute that was much admired
Right.
in by the Vikings. That that obstinacy and that
Hmm.
iron will.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in women and men, like,
Hmm.
like odd, and uh, when after her husband and her father were killed and she had that boat made in secret in the woods of Scotland and then got away with her family and married her granddaughters off to all these kings and then settled in Iceland. So she was well respected for
And even
that
Queen Osa,
bravery,
when she
right?
finally killed Gudrid, she just declared it openly, and she took her son and went back to her father's kingdom and claimed that as her kingdom because she had made a bold stroke. She
Hmm.
had taken vengeance, and that was the other thing is that it was that was we talked about that with Juliet a little bit too about how you could be a ring woman, which meant you were responsible for vengeance and you were also entitled to taking over your family's holdings, and that's what she did.
Yeah. All right. So, our next question: what are some of the common misperceptions about the Viking era? There's a lot. Do you see your writing as a means to correct some of the more obvious errors? My first
Absolutely.
answer, well, one, they did not wear horned helmets when they were in battle.
Yeah.
If they wore them, they were ceremonial.
Yeah. Well, and there's pictures of
Yeah.
them with things on their heads, but they're not necessarily horns. In one case, they're birds. There's two birds on a helmet.
Well, there's that one that looks like a dancing man, and he has
Hmm.
that look like horns. But I'm sure that was some kind of a
That's not
priest,
a war. Those
not
are
a priest, but
ceremonial.
like yeah, like the wise the sorcerer or whoever he was, the goatee. might have worn that during some kind of a ceremony.
Well, when you look at the Osberg tapestry, you see that there are both men and women wearing animal
Right.
skins or animal heads. They're
Hmm.
dressed as animals.
Yeah.
And but they're definitely humans. And there's a moose, it looks like a moose, there's a bear, there's a couple of boars, and different kinds of birds that are a little hard for us to interpret what kind they are.
Yeah,
But
but the horned helmets came from the opera,
yeah,
the
the Wagner.
Wagner opera, and what I read was that the reason they put the horns on them is so they could see better when they're on stage. It
Maybe.
was just a visual, just anyway. But it's just unfortunately it's stuck.
It's
Even
stuck.
though it would be so dumb to have horns on your
Yeah,
helmet when you're in a battle, like
I know. It's
Vikings were
crazy.
smarter warriors than that. They would
Yeah,
not have done
yeah,
that.
yeah, for sure. Well, and they did have some that had like a boar on the top of the helmet. And in Bernard Cornwell's Saxon Tales, he talks about Saxons as having these helmets that had like a boar
Hmm.
on the top, and that they were more they didn't wear them that much in battle. They were more ceremonial, but they were heirlooms that were handed down. So, but that's not horns.
Right, exactly. Not like what, people think now.
Yeah.
Well, and speaking of the Saxons, like one of the things that whenever I tell people that I write about Vikings, one of the things that's often mentioned to me is like, "Oh, the Vikings, they were so brutal." And I'm like, one, yes, they were, but they were no more brutal than anyone else around them at that time.
Hmm.
Because when you mention the Saxons, so Charlemagne
Oh,
in what, like around 500, I don't remember when, but remember Charlemagne.
he was in the 8th century. He died in like 810, I think.
Oh, is
810 or
that
813.
late? Oh my
Yeah,
gosh, why was I
813.
thinking he was earlier? But yeah, he beheaded 5,000 Saxon
Yeah,
warriors just because
yeah.
they wouldn't convert to
He
Christianity.
baptized them and then he beheaded them.
Yeah, 5,000 or so
Yeah.
of them.
He
Just
was very brutal.
yeah, and so were the English and the French. I mean, that whole
Yeah, because
yeah,
well, they were Franks and Anglo-Saxons
right?
and
Yeah,
Normans.
yeah.
Later became the Normans were, a little later, but yeah, they were, and the Irish too. They were always fighting, always
They were
killing each
all
other.
brutal. Yeah,
They were.
the Vikings didn't have like a claim on brutality in that time period. And even later, like, okay, so I'm going back to the Tudors. Maybe I shouldn't read a Tudor book before we record. But like they were talking about hanging, drawing, and quartering someone for
Yeah,
treason. I can't even
yeah,
imagine a more grisly, horrific way of
yeah.
killing someone. That's way worse than what the Vikings
I
would do
know.
on a regular basis. Like,
Yes.
I mean, to hang someone and then you take them down before they're dead.
Yeah. So they can make sure you wake them up so they can
Yeah,
feel it
yeah,
to the fullest.
yeah. And then disembowel them while they're still alive.
Yeah,
And then, I mean, it's just, it's,
that's way too much.
yeah. So, and this was what, in the 1500s?
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah. This is the Renaissance.
right? Yeah. Or even the witch trials. People often misremember the witch trials as being like some dark medieval time, but it's like, no,
It
it
wasn't.
was like the
It really wasn't.
1600s. So
Yeah.
that was one misperception I think happened. I think because for so long, all we got about Vikings were them raiding and pillaging and stuff.
Well, all
We
the
weren't,
history about them was written down by their victims,
right, exactly, like the monks.
the
And
monks and
so,
the, yeah.
yeah. So I wanted to show that they were more than that. Like my character Helgi, he ends up joining a trading crew, and they go all over the world and down to Constantinople, which is now in Istanbul, and trading furs and other
Right.
things. So,
And they still had to be pretty tough because they met
oh
with
yeah,
a lot of violence on the way. There were pirates and
yeah,
there
oh
were
yeah,
kitchen eggs and all these
oh
other
yeah, yeah, yeah.
tribes.
Yeah, they were no pushovers,
No.
but yeah, they knew how to fight. But yeah, but they weren't. That wasn't their goal.
Right.
And trading was a huge, huge aspect of the Vikings.
It
Yeah.
was the main part of that and farming were the two
Yeah.
main things. And the raiding was just more noticeable, I guess.
Right, exactly. Yeah, to everybody on the outside. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to show that farmers and craftsmen and people
Hmm.
who, oh, like the main character, one of the main characters in my book I'm working on right now, like his father was a farmer, he's a farmer, but he gets
Yeah.
called up when his local jarl wants to go
Raiding, yeah.
raiding or fighting or whatever. And so he has to fight and he's good at it. He just doesn't really want to do it. It's just kind of part of
It's
what
like
people
getting
did.
drafted,
Exactly. And he
which is
just,
something we don't know a lot about right now either in our
it's true.
generation.
So when he's called to fight, he goes but he really just kind of wants to stay on his farm with his children and his wife. He just wants to lead a quiet life. He doesn't want that.
Well, and even some of the early Viking Age laws that we were talking about with Juliet last time, they talk about that every man has to have an axe, bows and arrows. They
Mm,
have to have armaments. Every jarl or local chieftain has to have supply so many, for defense, but also for offense. So many
mhm.
warriors. So everybody had to train that way in their off time. And that's something, yeah, we haven't had to worry about for a few decades in this country.
Yeah, there are some countries where they still do that in Switzerland, where every young man
I don't know. Probably, I'm
has
sure
to
there's
serve
several
like a little
countries.
bit of time in like the reserves or whatever.
Yeah, it's
Hmm.
probably true. Another thing is they're thought of as being, Vikings are always thought of as being illiterate and crude.
Oh
That is
yeah.
not the case either, because a true warrior was a poet
Mm,
and they were literate. They had runes and they learned them from childhood. They just didn't write things down in big tomes, but
right.
they did know how to write. They were
That's true.
literate, and then the storytelling and the
Mm,
the reliance on memory was so important. The law speaker had to memorize all the laws. People had to memorize legends, and
mm.
they relied on what was inside their head more than what was outside. But that doesn't mean that they were illiterate or crude.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's a good place to mention their art too.
Hmm.
They had such beautiful art, like all different styles, like all those knotwork patterns. They actually
Yes,
used color when they did things like,
they did.
and that some of the Viking men were dandies. They wore colorful clothes and they dyed their hair and they wore jewelry and
And they
women.
bathed every week.
That's right, every
Saturday is
Saturday.
still called Lord Dog washing
That's
day or
right.
bath day. Yes.
So yeah, they decorated everything.
Hmm.
Obviously they loved beautiful things or they wouldn't have done that. So they weren't just a bunch of like, I mean, I think one of the common misperceptions, they're just like beasts, right? They're
Right.
just no better than an animal or
Smelly
something.
and
Yeah.
dirty. And they're
Yeah.
even portrayed that way. And that's
Right.
not how they were.
I mean, they were smellier and dirtier than we
Well, yeah.
are in the United States for the most part. 'Cause
Yeah, I
we
guess.
have running water. If they had running water and hot water, they'd be bathing.
And some of them actually did. I know they found one farmstead I think it was in Iceland, that had a brook running through the middle under the floorboards. So they had
Wow.
running water in the house. I
That's
can't
cool.
remember where I read that, but it was some archaeological thing I read. So interesting. They built their house right over this stream,
Hmm,
so they'd have running water.
interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, and one thing I wanted to talk about, I skipped over when we were talking about like how they might be different than us, is the whole idea of like a martial culture and PTSD.
Oh,
So
yeah.
before I wrote my books, I did a bunch of research about PTSD and like different kinds of cultures. And the one book that I came across that I really found interesting, it was called, let's see, I wrote it down. Achilles in Vietnam, Combat Trauma and the Undoing of Character by Jonathan Shea. And
Oh,
he's a clinical psychiatrist and he worked with Vietnam veterans. And the reason why he called it Achilles in Vietnam is because he went back and he was looking at like these ancient warlike societies and how they dealt with war and like when men came back from war, right? And how they treated things versus how
mm,
we were treating Vietnam veterans and stuff. And what's the difference? Why, did these men suffer from PTSD and what would it have looked like? And one of the things he pointed out was like these older cultures, and the Vikings would have fit into this too, is that where warfare was a part of life, they had these rituals and ceremonies to deal with it.
yes.
They had entry rituals, like with the Vikings, they would often have like a feast and they would dedicate things to Odin and sacrifice an animal maybe, and maybe pass around
They're
like some,
cults. They're warrior
yeah,
cults.
exactly, to kind of like get,
Legitimatize for one
yeah,
thing.
yeah, and get them into the mindset of doing that. And then they would often have feasts and things when they got back to celebrate the men who had died or and so those entry and exit rituals are really important for people and I think we don't really do that anymore. We certainly let down Vietnam veterans.
Yeah,
It was terrible what
it
happened. But
was.
so that's, when you don't have any way for these warriors to assimilate back into society, then of course they're going to struggle and they're going to
Yes.
suffer. I mean, these guys in the Viking Age, I'm sure they still suffered from PTSD, but I think the stories you talked about and the storytelling, the rituals, the ceremonies, the fact that they were respected in their society is all helpful
Yes.
and
Yes.
different.
Yeah, yeah. And it was throughout the ages
Right.
until recently, because World War II veterans were much honored and,
Hmm.
you know.
That's true. I mean, they still suffered from PTSD, but at
Hmm.
least like when they got back, there was the GI Bill, and they were,
Right.
like given loans and stuff to get
Well,
buy
even
houses and do things like that.
even Vietnam era veterans did have some of those things. Because
Yeah,
my husband is a Vietnam era
but
veteran.
society wasn't
Society
kind
did
to
not,
them.
yeah, welcome them. No,
Hmm.
no. But they did have those, the military still had those
Mm.
things that they
Well, that's good at
were
least.
eligible for. So I just ran across, I was looking for this, that very well-known quote about Viking male grooming
Oh
that
yeah,
was an account by a 12th century writer, John of Wallingford.
I love this one.
Yeah, he details the consequences, apparently the incoming Danes. So this is a little later than the High Viking Age, but he says they caused much trouble to the natives of the land, for they were wont, after the fashion of their country, to comb their hair every day, to bathe every Saturday, to change their garments often, and set off their persons by many frivolous devices. In this manner, they laid siege to the virtue of the married woman and persuaded the daughters, even of the noble, to be their concubines.
I love that.
I know, I know. I had to find it though, because I couldn't remember exactly who to attribute it to. But
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
and
And
combs are a really common thing that you find in Viking graves.
very common. There's
Yeah,
so many
everybody
of them.
had their
Hmm.
comb, and they're really kind of flea combs because
Yeah.
they're
Oh,
very
that's another
fine
thing.
tooth.
That was another thing that I did not. I'm like, I am
No,
not getting
no,
into like
chicken nits,
lice and
no.
fleas and bed
No,
bugs and no, thank you.
no. And they're so, they're common, fairly common nowadays too.
Yeah, true. Yeah, working at the library, the
I was going to
you have to
say
be on the
school
lookout for
children,
bed bugs and stuff coming
and they're
back in
so
books.
contagious. Wow. The
Yeah.
lice is so contagious.
Yeah, yes, kids still get it. Yeah.
Yep, they do. Once one person has it, the rest of them get it.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing people like writing and people who talk about rules of writing, like use all five senses. And I'm often like, if I'm in some kind of thing, I'm like, um,
Not
so
always.
I write about the
Well,
Vikings and
yeah,
I
we'll
don't
skip the
use
smell.
this. I usually kind of skip the sense of smell unless somebody smells good for some
Yeah.
reason or different or, like I even just the other day I had my character, oh, she hugged this guy. And he smelled, his tunic was clean, but she could tell he had set it by like the fire or something because it smelled like smoke.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, they probably always smelled like smoke.
I suspect they did. They did. So another misconception is, that women were chattel property and that males were dominant. And, that I think we kind of covered in an earlier talk, but because women did have rights. The men may or may not have been the head of the household, but there were certainly cases where women could take over and they weren't chattel property. That didn't come until the Normans. And I
Hmm.
think we covered that in one of our earlier podcasts.
But they were married sometimes for alliances and things like
Oh
that.
yeah.
They were
Oh yeah.
peace weavers.
Absolutely. Definitely. But that doesn't mean they were chattel property.
Right, 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 right.
There's a big difference there between making an alliance
Hmm.
and not having any say.
Right,
And
like even
women
my
could
character,
divorce.
yeah, even my character in my Norse family trilogy, she's not forced to marry this guy, but they are strongly
Hmm.
advising her to
Yes.
do it, and she does it for the good of the family.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah. Yes. No, that part is very true. But the whole idea that they had no choice, I mean, we explored that at length in one of our earlier podcasts. Um,
yeah, and I'm writing a story now where one of my characters, she has been taken captive,
mhm,
and because she's at this disadvantage, she might have to marry somebody she doesn't want to, just to get out of being a captive. So anyway, I mean, yeah,
mhm,
they still sometimes had to marry people they didn't want to. But so did men. So, but they
mhm.
they had an easier. I don't know.
I don't know if it's easy as the right, but they just had more power.
They had more options.
Yeah. So when I look at where we discussed this, it was in episode 11, February 2024. We talked about the rights and power of Anglo-Saxon women.
Hmm.
It was two different episodes, but because they wrote down their laws and there was so much more written evidence from the Anglo-Saxon kingdom in England than there was for Scandinavians, we know a lot more about Anglo-Saxon women's rights than we do Viking Age women's
Mm.
rights. But they started out as the same cultures.
Hmm.
So we can infer a lot from what we learned about Anglo-Saxons.
Right.
And women did have definitely the right of divorce
Hmm.
until until quite a bit later.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Okay, so we have answered a lot of questions about like the Vikings and stuff. I think we should save the next questions, which are more about writing and writing related things, for the next time.
Yes.
I guess we'll see you next time.
Yep.
Bye. Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, KS, at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.